One I stood in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup, my hands working mechanically. The only one helping me was a little girl, barely 7 years old. She moved around the kitchen with determination, doing everything she could to assist me. Meanwhile, the rest of the household, the lazy good-for-nothings, were lounging in the living room, sprawled across the couch without a care in the world. Not one of them had even thought to lift a finger. From outside the house, my grandmother's sharp, commanding voice rang out loud enough to shake the walls. "Barbara, how long does it take to cook a meal? My precious grandson is starving. Can't you see he's crying? If anything happens to him because you're so slow, I swear I'll beat you." The little girl beside me flinched at Grandma's shouting, her small shoulders trembling for just a second. But when she looked up at me, her expression shifted. Her eyes grew steady, calm, almost protective. "Don't be scared," she whispered softly, her voice full of warmth. "Mommy's here." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. At that moment, I realized something incredible. My mother had been reborn too, and somehow we had swapped bodies. That was fine by me. My mother had always been too timid, too soft. Even if she'd been given another chance at life, her kind heart would never have been enough to stand up to this pack of wolves. But now that I was here, things were going to be different. I placed a hand on her shoulder and gave her a firm nod. "Stay here," I told her. "Let me handle this." In my previous life, my mom had been the family's punching bag. She'd sacrificed everything for them: her money, her health, her happiness. And yet, they'd treated her like dirt. I still remember the day she brought home 2 pounds of spare ribs, hoping to treat us to something nice. Grandma had found out and exploded with rage. "You greedy pig. Can't go a single day without stuffing your face, can you?" she'd screamed, dragging my mom by the hair and beating her senseless. Those ribs? Grandma had cooked them up and eaten every last bite with her sons. My mom never even got a taste. Her patience didn't earn her any gratitude. It only encouraged them to go further. They kept pushing and pushing until one day, they pushed her straight to her end. And me. I followed soon after. Now that I was back, I could see things clearly. There was no reason with people like them. No amount of kindness or tolerance would ever change their behavior. They saw gentleness as weakness and patience as an invitation to exploit. If they wanted a fight, I'd give them a war. Grabbing a heavy iron ladle in one hand and a pot lid in the other, I stormed out of the kitchen like a hurricane. Fury surged through me, hot and unrelenting, as I marched straight to the dining table. Without hesitation, I kicked it over, sending plates and bowls crashing to the floor. "All you ever do is eat," I yelled, my voice echoing through the room. "Are your hands broken? Are your legs useless? If you're hungry, why don't you cook for yourselves?" Grandma's eyes widened in shock. For a moment, she looked like a fish out of water, gasping for air. Then, like a spring-loaded trap, she shot up from the couch, her face twisted with rage. "Barbara," she screeched, "have you lost your damn mind? How dare you talk to me like that?" She lunged at me quick as a flash. For someone in her 60s, Grandma was surprisingly agile, her wiry frame moving with the speed of a monkey. But I was ready. With a loud clang, I brought the pot lid down on her face, the force of the blow sending her stumbling backward. She landed on the floor with a heavy thud, clutching her head as she wailed in pain. "Exclamation point," she cried, her voice shrill and panicked. "Your wife is rebelling. Are you just going to stand there? Help me." My dad, spineless as he was outside the house, suddenly sprang into action. Puffing out his chest, he rolled up his sleeves and charged at me, his hand reaching for my hair. He wasn't good for much, but when it came to fighting dirty, he'd inherited all of Grandma's nastiness. He aimed straight for my head, but I didn't flinch. Instead, I raised my foot and drove it straight into his groin. "Two." "Ah!" His face turned a sickly shade of purple as he crumpled to the floor, clutching himself and howling like a wounded animal. "Murder!" he choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "You're trying to murder me." I crouched down beside him, my lips curling into a cold smile. Before he could recover, I slapped him across the face once, twice, 3 times. The sharp sound echoed through the room, and his head lolled to one side, dazed. Before he could react, I grabbed the belt from his waist and stood up, snapping it in the air with a sharp crack. Do you think I'm still the same pushover you used to bully? Do you think I'll keep letting you treat me like dirt? Try laying a hand on me again and see what happens. In my past life, my mom had slaved away for this family. She'd worked a full-time job, only to come home and cook a 4-dish meal every night for 5 ungrateful mouths. She was more exhausted than a mule, but no one cared. They never appreciated her sacrifices. The moment something didn't go their way, they'd lash out with fists and insults. At just 38, my mother had been reduced to a shadow of her former self, a frail, broken woman with a body battered by years of abuse. Mom, are you insane? I turned to see my older brother, Frank, standing in the corner, his face pale but his voice trembling with fake outrage. That's Dad. That's Grandma. How can you hit them? You used to be so gentle. His words were laced with self-righteousness, as if he were the victim here. I let out a bitter laugh, turning to face him fully. Frank had always been the golden child. Grandma adored him, spoiling him rotten because he was the long-awaited male heir. He'd been treated like royalty, while I was treated like dirt. Now at 14, he was nearly 200 pounds of soft, pampered flesh. Feel sorry for them, do you? I asked, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Fine. Why don't you take their punishment for them? The first lash of the belt landed across his back, the second across his arm. Frank shrieked, stumbling backward in shock. You crazy woman, he screamed. How dare you hit me? Oh, so what? I sneered, snapping the belt across his face. Blood spattered as 2 of his teeth went flying. I'm your mother. It's my job to teach you a lesson when you step out of line. Or do you think you're above discipline? He opened his mouth to curse again, but the next lash silenced him. His face twisted in fear as he cowered, his eyes darting around for an escape. For the first time, this family was learning what it felt like to be on the receiving end. 3. Just then, the front door creaked open, and in walked Richard, my uncle. He was a wiry man with a face that always seemed to be searching for trouble. He froze in the doorway, his eyes darting between the overturned table, the scattered plates, and the bruised faces of my so-called family. What the hell is going on here? He barked, his eyebrows nodding in confusion. Richard was 35, unemployed and proud of it. He'd been drifting through life like a leaf in the wind, never working a day in his life, but always quick to show up at our house when he needed a free meal. If all he did was eat our food, I might have been able to tolerate him. But no, Richard wasn't just another mouth to feed. He was a full-blown accomplice. Whenever my dad and grandma ganged up on my mom, Richard played the loyal enforcer. He'd stand guard at the door, making sure she couldn't run for help. He liked to keep his hands clean, but in my book, he was just as guilty as the rest of them. I let out a short, humorless laugh. Without saying a word, I grabbed the iron ladle in my hand and swung it straight at his head. Clang! Ow! What the? Richard yelped, stumbling backward and clutching his head. He stared at me wide-eyed, as if I'd just grown a second head. What's your problem? He shouted, ducking as I swung again. You, I said coldly, are my problem. He scrambled away, tripping over his own feet as I advanced on him. Grandma, realizing that no one in the house could stop me, bolted for the door. She threw it open and began wailing at the top of her lungs, hoping to rally the neighbors to her side. Help! Somebody help! My daughter-in-law has gone mad. She's attacking us. She wants to murder me. In the past, this kind of stunt always worked. My mom hated public drama more than anything. The moment neighbors started poking their heads out, she'd shrink into herself, too embarrassed to fight back. But me? I wasn't my mother. Sure enough, a small crowd began to gather. The neighbors shuffled closer, their curiosity piqued, and they started murmuring amongst themselves. What's going on? One of them asked. An older man with a gruff voice chimed in. Barbara, why are you making such a scene? It's your family. Can't you just let it go? No need to air your dirty laundry like this. Another woman, her arms crossed over her chest, added sharply, honestly, I've never seen a daughter-in-law so vicious. Poor. If I were your husband, I'd have divorced you ages ago. I couldn't help but laugh at that. A low, bitter laugh that came from deep in my chest. Oh, I see how it is, I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. When I was the one getting beaten black and blue, you all told me to endure it. Keep the peace, you said. Don't make trouble. But now that I'm fighting back, suddenly I'm the villain? Let me guess, because I'm a woman, right? I'm supposed to bow my head and take it quietly. A burly man with a thick neck and an inflated sense of self-importance scoffed. You're damn right. Women should know their place. We men work hard to put food on the table. The least you can do is take care of the family without complaining. I cocked my head at him, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Oh, is that right? Well, let me tell you something. I'm the one putting food on this table. My hardworking husband? He brings home $600 a month. Me, I bring in $1,000. So tell me, who's really keeping this family afloat? The man's sneer faltered, and he fell silent, his bravado crumbling under the weight of my words. A thin woman with tired eyes stepped forward hesitantly. But you have children, don't you? For their sake, can't you just let it go? You don't want them growing up in a broken home, do you? I turned to her, my gaze sharp and unrelenting. Oh, I've thought about the kids. My loving husband, he's already looking for someone to replace me. He's planning to bring home a new wife and give my children a stepmother. So tell me, who's really breaking up this family? My words hit like a slap. The neighbors who'd been so eager to lecture me suddenly had nothing to say. They exchanged awkward glances, their self-righteous expressions slipping away, before retreating back to their homes one by one. Once the last of them had slinked off, I turned back to the house and slammed the door shut with a resounding bang. My gaze swept over the sorry lot in the living room. Grandma, Dad, Richard, all of them bruised, battered, and glaring at me with a mixture of fear and disbelief. I crossed my arms and leaned against the doorframe, my voice cold and steady. Now, I said, let's talk about the divorce. 4. My mom might be soft-spoken, but she's no pushover. The moment she found out my sorry excuse for a father was cheating, she didn't waste time crying or begging. Instead, she started gathering evidence, determined to take him to court and make the divorce stick. But of course, nothing in this family is ever that simple. Her careful planning was derailed by Frank, my two-faced, opportunistic older brother. Frank is the kind of guy who could sell sand in the desert. On one side, he cozied up to Dad's mistress, pulling out all the stops to play the sweet, dutiful son, milking her for favors and gifts. On the other, he clung to my mother, insisting she couldn't go through with the divorce because we need to keep the family together. What a joke. Frank didn't care about the family. What he really cared about was himself. He'd overheard that Dad's mistress was pregnant, and the thought of a new baby joining the family sent him into a panic. He wasn't ready to lose his golden status as the only beloved son, the one Grandma and Dad spoiled rotten. That's why he was so desperate to stop the divorce. The worst part, I wouldn't have known any of this if Frank hadn't bragged about it to me in a past life. Back then, I couldn't wrap my head around why Frank always lived like royalty, even though our family wasn't well off. He went to private schools, had new clothes, and never seemed to go without. It all made sense now. He'd been playing both sides all along. And Dad? Oh, Dad knew exactly what Frank was up to. But did he care? Not a chance. As far as he was concerned, the mistress was just a fling, a pretty soft-spoken plaything to make him feel young and adored. Wives, on the other hand, were there to do the real work, cooking, cleaning, and taking care of the house. Why trade one for the other when he could have both? So, the second I announced I was filing for divorce, Dad and Frank were on me like vultures. Frank came first. His face was still puffy and red from our earlier fight, but that didn't stop him from putting on a show. He ran up to me, tears streaming down his face, and dropped to his knees like he was auditioning for a soap opera. Mom, please, he sobbed, voice cracking. If you and Dad get divorced, this family will be broken. Please, I know you're angry, but can't you forgive him just this once? He made a mistake, okay? Everyone deserves a second chance. I stared at him unimpressed. A mistake, I echoed, raising an eyebrow. Slowly, I pulled out my phone, scrolling through the folder of evidence I'd gathered. Photos, texts, receipts, it was all there. I held the screen up to his face. Here's what I don't get, Frank. If Dad made a mistake, why are you so invested in covering for him? You've been running around calling that woman Mom, like she's some kind of angel. Where was all this family loyalty then, huh? Frank's face turned a sickly shade of white. he stammered, trying to come up with a response. But I didn't give him the chance. He lunged for my phone, hands outstretched to grab it. But I was ready for him. With one swift motion, I stuck out my leg and tripped him. He went down like a sack of potatoes, landing flat on his face. When he looked up, one of his front teeth was missing. I couldn't help but laugh. The great Frank, brought down by his own clumsiness. Next up was Dad. He shuffled forward, wringing his hands like a desperate salesman. "Barbara," he started, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "This whole thing, it's just a misunderstanding. That woman, she seduced me. I promise I'll cut her off. Please, let's not do this. We don't need to get divorced, do we?" I didn't even bother responding. I kicked him aside, holding my phone up like a weapon. "Let me make this clear," I said, my voice cold. "This divorce is happening. Daniel cheated. He's at fault. And according to the law, that means he leaves with nothing. Get ready to walk out of this marriage empty-handed." At that, Dad jumped to his feet, his groveling act vanishing in an instant. His face twisted with rage, and he jabbed a finger in my direction. "You vicious woman," he bellowed. "You think you can take everything from me? Over my dead body? If anyone's walking away with nothing, it's you." I rolled my eyes. "You should really brush up on divorce laws before you start yelling. Why don't you go look it up and see who's actually in the wrong here?" Realizing he was losing, Dad switched tactics again. His voice softened and he started pleading. "Okay, fine," he said. "You can have the money. But the house, that stays with me. Where else will we live if you take it?" How clever. He knew the house was the most valuable asset we had. But I didn't care about the house. It hadn't felt like a home in years. The once bright, spacious apartment had been gutted and divided into tiny rooms. 5 or 6 of them, all cramped and dark. No one would buy it, even if we tried to sell it. "Fine," I said with a shrug. "Keep the house. But you're going to pay back my money." That money had come from my mom's hard-earned savings. She'd spent months running back and forth to the hospital, taking care of Grandma like a full-time nurse. And we never asked for anything in return. Not back then, when we were still family. But now it was different. Debts needed to be paid. Grandma's face twisted in anger. "That money was a gift," she snapped. "Why should I pay it back? And even if I wanted to, we don't have the money. So forget it." I smiled a sharp, cold smile. "Oh, you don't want to pay it back? Fine. Then let's settle this another way. You owe us $30,000 and your life. If you're ready to give up the latter, I'll forget the former." Before anyone could react, I grabbed an empty wine bottle from the table and smashed it against the counter. The jagged edge glinted in the light as I held it up to Grandma's throat. "Pay up," I said quietly, "or pay with your life." The room went silent. Grandma's tough act crumbled, her lips trembling as she stared at the bottle. But she still tried to save face. You wouldn't dare," she hissed. "Go ahead. Let's see if you have the guts." 5. In my previous life, my grandmother left behind a fortune of $80,000 when she gone. It wasn't some windfall either. It was money she had pinched and scraped together over decades, hoarding every spare coin like a dragon guarding its treasure. But despite all her supposed thrift, not a single cent of it was ever spent on me. No, every last penny went to her precious son and her beloved grandson Frank. So don't tell me she couldn't afford to pay back the $30,000 she owed us. Of course she could, she just didn't want to. I let out a sharp, humorless laugh as I pressed the jagged edge of the broken bottle against her neck. The glass grazed her skin, sharp enough to draw blood. That was when she finally realized I wasn't bluffing. Her face twisted in terror, and she started screaming hysterically, her voice so loud it made my ears ring. "Give her the money! Quickly! Give her the money!" she screeched, her usual arrogance crumbling into raw panic. Behind her, my pathetic dad chimed in, his voice dripping with melodrama. "Mom, where are we supposed to find that much money?" Grandma spun on him, her fear making her voice shrill. "I have $50,000 in my account. The password is Frank's birthday. Transfer it to her now." She's crazy. I watched them scramble to do as she said, their panic almost comical. Once I saw the money safely transferred into my account, I finally let go of her. The moment she was free, Grandma's fear quickly turned to fury. She opened her mouth to lash out at me, but before she could get a word in, I grabbed a belt hanging nearby and swung it at Frank. The leather cracked against his back, and Frank let out a high-pitched yelp, clutching the spot where it hit. "Go ahead," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "Try laying a hand on me again. I'll make sure your precious grandson can't sit down for a week." The room fell silent. Frank, the golden child of the family, stood frozen, his face red with both pain and humiliation. No one dared to move, let alone challenge me. They all knew that Frank was the one person they couldn't afford to see hurt. Satisfied that I'd put them in their place, I turned to my mom. I said calmly, "Go pack your things. We're leaving." Grandma's face paled. "You can take," she blurted out, desperation thick in her voice. "But you're not taking Frank with you." Her words didn't faze me. I had no intention of taking him anyway. He could stay with his precious grandma, just like she wanted. I shrugged. "Fine by me," I said. "You've got 3 days to figure out your next move. After that, you can deal with my lawyer." Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Frank glaring at me, his lips pressed into a thin line. I knew exactly what he was thinking. Without my financial support, his pampered, cushy life was about to come crashing down. Frank had always lived like a prince, but that was because I'd been the one footing the bill. Without me, his temper alone would be enough to tear this family apart. And then there was my uncle. He wasn't much better. With his diabetes and constant need for expensive treatments, he'd been bleeding my mom dry for years. She'd been the one covering his medical bills, filling the holes he'd dug for himself. But now, he was on his own. I could already picture it. The chaos, the fights, the desperation. Frank was throwing tantrums. My uncle was scrambling for money, and Grandma was trying to hold it all together. The house would turn into a war zone without me or my mom to keep things running. Honestly, I couldn't wait to see it all fall apart. 6. After packing our things, I left with my mom, walking out of that suffocating house for good. She walked beside me in silence, her expression unreadable. I glanced at her, worried, and softened my voice. "Mom, are you upset? Did I scare you back there?" She shook her head, and to my surprise, a proud smile spread across her face. "Scared? No, not at all. You were amazing. You did everything I've dreamed of doing for years, but never had the courage to. My daughter is incredible." Hearing the admiration in her words, I couldn't help but laugh. "Well, Mom, from now on, I promise you'll have nothing to worry about. This time, I'll make sure you live a happy life." I called a cab and took her to my grandparents' house. When we arrived and stepped inside, my grandfather looked up, his face as stern as ever. "So, you finally remembered where your family is, huh?" But as soon as his eyes landed on my mom, his expression melted into a grin, the corners of his eyes crinkling with joy. "Laura, you're here too." He walked over and pulled her into a warm, almost crushing hug. My mom froze, staring at me like she had no idea what was happening. Her father's sudden show of affection left her completely bewildered, as though she was a little girl again, unsure of how to respond to his overwhelming presence. I cleared my throat awkwardly, breaking the moment. "Grandpa, Dad, I've made up my mind. I'm divorcing Daniel." His smile disappeared in an instant. His face darkened, and for a long moment he said nothing, just stared at me. I couldn't tell what he was thinking, and it made me nervous. To be honest, my memories of my grandparents were vague. I'd heard stories growing up about how my mom had fought with them bitterly in order to marry my dad. After the wedding, she'd rarely come back to visit, and as a result, I'd barely spent any time with them. But I did remember one thing clearly. In my previous life, at my mom's funeral, both of them had cried like their hearts were breaking. Despite everything, they deeply loved her. Finally, Grandpa broke the silence. "Are you sure? Have you really thought this through?" I met his gaze and nodded firmly. "I've thought about it and I'm sure. Daniel cheated. I won't tolerate him anymore." Grandpa let out a sharp, disapproving snort. "I told you from the start he was no good. But no, you had to marry him anyway." At that moment, my grandmother walked in from the kitchen, carrying a plate of steaming ribs. The smell wafted through the room, instantly lifting the mood. "She just got here," Grandma scolded, glaring at Grandpa. "Do you have to start nagging her already?" Let's not talk about anything unpleasant right now. Come on, let's eat. It was just an ordinary dinner, but somehow, it felt like the warmest meal I'd had in years. Grandma kept fussing over me, asking if I was eating enough, if I was sleeping well, and if I was too stressed. Grandpa, for all his gruffness, kept sneaking pieces of ribs onto my plate, and onto my mom's too. He tried to act casual about it, but the care in his actions was obvious. That night, I took my mom to the guest room to rest. At first, she seemed happy, even relaxed. But then, just as we were settling in, her face crumpled. Tears welled up in her eyes, and before long, she was crying so hard she could barely breathe. The sight of her breaking down like that made my chest ache. I sat beside her, gently rubbing her back as she sobbed. Through her tears, she whispered, "He wasn't always like this. He used to be so kind. He promised me he'd take care of me for the rest of my life." I nodded quietly and said, "I know, Mom. If he hadn't been that way, you wouldn't have married him." The truth was, my dad hadn't always been the spineless man he eventually became. When he was younger, he was handsome and smooth-talking, the kind of man who could charm anyone with a few well-placed words. My mom, naive and inexperienced, had fallen for him completely. But promises made before marriage are easy to break. The reality of daily life, bills, chores, responsibilities, quickly stripped away the illusion of harmony. And when my grandmother moved in, her constant interference only made things worse. For a while, things improved after my brother was born. Back then, my mom was treated like a hero for giving the family a son. But that brief happiness didn't last. Soon, they were arguing again, unable to agree on how to raise him. It didn't take long for their relationship to fall back into the same bitter pattern. My mom had told me all of this in my previous life. Toward the end, when her health was failing and her spirit completely broken, she would often sit with me, holding my hand and reminiscing about the past. Those conversations only made my hatred for that family grow. My mom could have had an amazing life, but they destroyed her. She'd wanted to leave so many times, but my spineless dad and selfish brother always found ways to trap her. In that life, she passed away at just 55. By then, she was barely a shadow of the vibrant woman she'd once been. But this time, things would be different. It wasn't too late. 41 is still young. My mom might feel like a wilted flower now, but I would make sure she bloomed again. This time I'd protect her. This time, I'd help her live the life she deserved. 7. The next morning, I went to the lawyer's office to have the divorce papers drafted. By the afternoon, just as I was going over the details, I got an unexpected phone call. "Is this Laura's guardian?" A sharp, impatient voice asked. "Your child was involved in a fight at school. Please come in immediately." A fight? That couldn't be right. My first thought wasn't that my mom had gotten into trouble. It was that someone had bullied her. I didn't hesitate. Grabbing my things, I rushed to the school. When I arrived, the scene that greeted me was almost surreal. A group of kids sat in the corner sniffling, their faces bruised and blotchy from tears. And standing triumphantly in the middle of it all, hands on her hips like a tiny general who'd just won a war, was my mom. "Are you okay? Did they hurt you?" I hurried to her side, scanning her for injuries. "Hurt me?" she scoffed, puffing out her chest. "Don't worry. If anyone's getting hurt, it's them." She raised a fist in the air as if daring the kids to try her again. The teacher, clearly at her wit's end, shot her a glare. "Laura, do you even realize what you've done? How can you still act so smug?" Unbothered, my mom met her glare head on. "Why shouldn't I? They started it. Maybe instead of scolding me, you should be asking why we fought in the first place. Or does being a teacher mean nothing to you anymore?" The teacher opened her mouth to respond, but I cut her off with a sharp look that made her think twice. I knelt down to my mom's level and softened my voice. "Mom, tell me what happened." Her defiance faded slightly as she explained. "They said I was an abandoned kid with no parents who loved me. They made fun of my clothes, called me a beggar, ripped up my textbooks, and even pulled my hair." Her words hit me hard. Memories came rushing back, memories I'd buried long ago. As a child, I'd gone through exactly the same thing. Back then, I'd tried telling the teacher, but all I ever got was dismissive. "It's just kids being kids." Eventually, I gave up. learned to swallow my pride, and endured the bullying in silence. But my mom? She didn't swallow anything. She fought back. The teacher let out an exasperated sigh. So you thought hitting them was the right solution? My mom crossed her arms and stood her ground. What else was I supposed to do? I told you about this before, and you said it was just harmless teasing, and told me not to take it seriously. But if a teacher won't stand up for me, who will? Am I supposed to just sit there and let them humiliate me? I had to defend myself. I shot the teacher a cold look. You know, this could have been avoided if you'd done your job. Even a simple warning to those kids would have been enough to stop this from escalating. Instead, you ignored the problem. I'll be taking this up with the principal. Teachers like you are the reason this school has so many bullies. Her face turned red with embarrassment, but before she could respond, the parents of the injured kids stormed into the room. What the hell happened? Who hurt my son? One of them demanded, pointing to the boy with a swollen lip. Look at my daughter's face. Who's responsible for this? Another mother screeched. I stepped forward calmly. That would be my mom. She defended herself after your children bullied her. Let me explain what really happened. I laid out the full story, detailing every insult, every snide remark, and every act of physical aggression. But instead of listening, the parents exploded. Well, no wonder she's violent, one of them sneered. Like mother, like daughter. Trash breeds trash. I've never seen such an ill-mannered little brat, another chimed in. Clearly, she gets it from her upbringing. How dare you lay a hand on my son? We don't even scold him at home. And now he's been beaten by some wild little girl. It was clear they didn't care about the truth. They just wanted someone to blame. One of the fathers stepped forward, his voice turning threatening. You think you can just hurt my kid and walk away? Someone needs to teach you. Before he could finish, my mom suddenly stepped in front of me, her small frame radiating pure fury. Go ahead, she shouted, her voice ringing out like a battle cry. Touch my daughter. I dare you. You lay a finger on her, and I'll make sure your kids get double what they gave me. 8. The parents were stunned. Taking advantage of their shock, I took off my shoe and slapped their faces. If you won't discipline your kids, I will. Smack. Smack. A few slaps later, the once arrogant parents were crying. The principal arrived, shocked to see me on top of the parents like a victorious rooster. She was stunned, but after hearing our sides, she tried to mediate. Both sides are at fault, but Laura's mom, you shouldn't have hit anyone. I sat back, acting like a boss. They bullied more than just my child. You want to settle this? Bring those kids here too. They thought they had strength in numbers. I could call for backup too. I quickly listed 7 or 8 names. Laura, go get these kids. Tell them the principal will back them up. Don't be afraid. No. The bullies admitted, no need. We admit our mistake. Seeing their confession, the parents had no choice but to apologize too. In the end, both sides apologized, but we had the upper hand, having beaten them. Back home, I asked my mom, do you want to transfer schools? She shook her head. No need. After today, they won't dare bully me. She looked sad. I'm your mom, but I didn't know what you went through at school. I'm a terrible mom. I held her hand. I know you love me. You're the best mom in the world, so don't be sad. And today you protected me well. Keep protecting me. Okay. She nodded firmly. 9. In the following days, I handled work matters. I quit my job, planning to start my own business. This was also my mom's idea. It was the year 2000, a golden time to make money. With our rebirth, we could seize the opportunity. We had $20,000 from the awful family, enough to open a shop. That night, we slept with hope for the future. The next day, after dropping my mom at school, I met the lawyer at the agreed location with Daniel's family. My dad was already there, accompanied by a young, gentle woman, likely his mistress. Though not particularly beautiful, she was gentle and caring, feeding him cake as I arrived, bringing the mistress to provoke me before the divorce was even finalized. They were clearly waiting for me to react. I strode up to them and slapped the back of my dad's head. He jerked forward, his teeth clinking against the metal fork. When he looked up again, a small piece of his front tooth was missing. Oofed. Both the lawyer and I couldn't help but laugh. What are you laughing at? My dad snapped, frowning. I composed myself. Nothing. Just thought you looked particularly unique today. My dad, still trying to charm, brushed his hair back, revealing his swollen face and the missing tooth. Barbara, I knew you couldn't bear to leave me. I felt nauseous. How had I not noticed his narcissism before? I handed him the draft of the divorce agreement. Take a look. If everything's in order, sign it. Even now, my dad seemed incredulous. You really want to divorce me? Think carefully. You're already 38. If you divorce me, no one else will marry you. With each word, the mistress's face grew paler. She looked at Daniel, disbelieving. What are you saying? You promised to divorce her and marry me. Don't you remember I'm carrying your child? Daniel quickly reassured her. Olivia, you know I only love you. I smiled and addressed her. Miss Olivia, please don't misunderstand. Daniel doesn't want to divorce me because he sees me as a free housekeeper. He can't bear to lose such a good servant. But once I leave, you can take over that role. Olivia, with a proud look, said, Daniel would never make me a housekeeper, right, Daniel? I nodded. He used to say the same to me. Daniel's infidelity was his fault. I didn't blame Olivia for breaking up our family. If Daniel hadn't strayed, no one could have lured him away. He was the one who changed. As for Olivia, she genuinely seemed to love my dad. But they were still in the honeymoon phase. Once married, Olivia would likely face the same fate as my mom, dealing with a meddling grandmother, a troublesome brother, and a freeloading uncle. I hoped to warn her, but she misunderstood, thinking I was challenging her. What do you mean? Are you regretting it? I knew you wouldn't divorce easily. Fine, if she wanted to misunderstand, so be it. I urged. If there are no issues, sign the papers. I have other things to do. Daniel and Olivia reviewed the contract together. Their faces grew darker with each clause. You only want Laura's custody? Not Frank's. I nodded. Yes, your mom wants to keep her precious grandson. I'm just fulfilling her wish. Besides, Frank is older and closer to you. Why separate you? Daniel looked at Olivia. What do you think? Olivia leaned back, pretending to be magnanimous. I'll treat Frank as my own. Even when our child is born, I'll be good to him. Seeing her agreement, Daniel signed the divorce papers. According to the contract, they had to pay me an additional $40,000. Naturally, this money came from Olivia's pocket. She was the daughter of a small business owner, not wealthy but comfortable. I wondered what she saw in my dad. Perhaps it was true love, but I doubted it would last. 10. With the money and divorce certificate in hand, I started my business. I opened a small deli specializing in marinated dishes. My mom, in her efforts to please my dad's family, had taken culinary courses. With decades of experience, her cooking was top-notch, especially her marinated dishes, which were fragrant and delicious. I set up shop near a school, attracting many students and parents. On the first day, we made a substantial profit. In the following days, our earnings multiplied. Our deli was clean and hygienic, and parents, too tired to cook, often bought our dishes for their families. 6 months later, I was preparing to open a second location. I was thriving, my spirits lifted, looking younger than ever. But Daniel's family wasn't doing so well. Recently, Daniel had gone to my former workplace to reconcile, but I had already quit. He couldn't find me. A former colleague told me about his visit. He could have gone to Laura's school, but he didn't even know which school she attended. He had always been an absentee father, giving all his attention to Frank. I had never received any care from him. Curious, I inquired about their current situation. As expected, their lives were chaotic. Initially, Grandma treated Olivia like a queen, seeing her as a wealthy businessman's daughter and pregnant with a child. But soon, Olivia fell down the stairs and lost the baby. The accident left her unable to conceive again. I suspected foul play, likely by Frank. He wouldn't want another child to compete for affection. Grandma, realizing Olivia couldn't bear children, turned hostile, constantly berating her. Olivia, unlike my mom, fought back. But Olivia, a pampered young lady, couldn't handle a fierce old woman. I had subdued them with my past life's experience of being beaten. Olivia ended up getting beaten by Grandma. Neighbors said she came out with a swollen face the next day. Realizing the family's toxicity, Olivia demanded a divorce. Daniel refused, but Olivia's powerful father intervened, forcing the divorce and ruining Daniel's job. Daniel, lacking skills, couldn't find a comparable job. He was too proud for lesser jobs, ending up unemployed like his brother. But soon, Grandma would die of meningitis, and the brothers would likely fight over the inheritance. 11. A year later, I opened my fifth deli. As a rapidly rising entrepreneur, I was invited for a TV interview. My business boomed even more. Daniel, learning of my success, brought Frank to my company. In less than 2 years, he had become disheveled and haggard, with unkempt stubble and dull eyes. Frank had lost weight, still overweight but with a visible jawline. I pinched his face, marveling. "What, didn't Grandma take good care of you? You've lost so much weight." Mentioning Grandma, Frank teared up. Grandma passed away from meningitis. Why had it happened so soon? Before I could ask, Daniel lamented. "It's all my useless brother's fault. He racked up debts and Mom died of anger. I had to sell the house." I feigned sympathy. "Where are you living now?" "Daniel, Mom bought a small 30-square-foot house. We're crammed in there." I nodded. "How pitiful." Thinking I was concerned, Daniel continued. "Barbara, I know you still care. Now that Mom's gone, let's start over." I was stunned by his shamelessness. Grandma's death was his chance to reconcile. No wonder Frank was such a scoundrel, inheriting his father's bad genes. Daniel didn't want to reconcile out of love. He was just old and tired, seeking comfort. If a young woman like Olivia still wanted him, he wouldn't look back. A leopard doesn't change its spots. This scoundrel wouldn't change. Daniel signaled Frank, who lunged at me. With his size, he'd crush me. I pushed Daniel in front of me, letting him take the hit. Crack! I heard a bone break. At 45, Daniel couldn't withstand Frank's weight. Daniel's eyes rolled back, unable to scream. I kindly suggested, "Take him to the hospital. He might have a fracture." Frank hesitated, still trying to persuade me. "Mom, Dad and I miss you. We need you." I smiled, pulling out a belt and lightly slapping his face. "I'm not your mom. I only have one child, Laura. Call me Mom again, and I won't be so gentle. And if you don't take him to the hospital, he'll be a burden for life." Frank, terrified, cried, "You're not my mom. I don't have such a vicious mom." Smack! The belt hit the ground with a thud. I smiled at them. "You're right. I'm not your mom. Now get out, or I'll show no mercy." Daniel, defiant, said, "We won't leave. Do your worst. We'll sue. Your reputation will be ruined. Give us $1 million, and we'll disappear." So reconciliation was a ruse. They wanted money. I laughed. "Try it. See if you can sue me for defamation, or get a penny from me." Frank yelled, "You're rich. What's $1 million to you?" Their entitlement was astounding, as if $1 million was pocket change. I didn't hold back, lashing his mouth. "Even if I had money, I wouldn't give it to you scoundrels." Frank's lips swelled, silencing him. Daniel panicked. "Let's talk. Don't hit the child. He did nothing wrong. Blame me." I laughed. He still protected Frank, but it was time to reveal Frank's true nature. "Daniel, if Olivia's child hadn't died, you'd still be together, right? Her family is rich. $1 million is nothing to them. You wouldn't be groveling now." Mentioning Olivia, Daniel looked defeated and Frank turned pale. "Daniel, do you remember? When I was pregnant with Laura, I also fell down the stairs. How coincidental." Daniel wasn't stupid. He quickly realized the truth, glaring at Frank. Frank turned pale. "Dad, let me explain." Daniel slapped him. "You brat. You ruined my life." Frank, no longer pretending, shouted back. "I ruined your life? You couldn't keep a woman. You useless old man. Always taking it out on me. I'll kill you." They started fighting. Frank, big and strong, quickly overpowered Daniel. I watched their father-son brawl, sending the recording to Olivia's father. By chance, I had connected with him through work. He was reasonable, knowing his daughter was at fault. He often helped me out of guilt. We became friends. I knew he'd handle the recording appropriately. Then I called the police. "Hello, there's a fight here." Let the police deal with them. Frank, though underage, had severely injured Daniel. He wouldn't escape punishment. I wouldn't let him. With Olivia's father's help, Frank wouldn't get out easily. Afterward, I felt refreshed, finally rid of that awful family. From now on, my mom and I would have a bright future, while they rotted in the shadows.